You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode.
Before we get started on this episode, here's a not-so-short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster nor the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak to a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's mold education courses, such as Mold 101 and the Mycotoxin Prevention Kit, by going to cnccontractorservices.com. Again, check out his mold education courses at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello everyone. Before we dive into this episode, I wanted to share some exciting news. I'll be speaking at the Healthy Home Summit, a free online event dedicated to helping you create a healthier living environment. If you want to go deeper on protecting your home and your family's health, grab the registration link I've put in this episode's description, sign up, and join me at the Healthy Home Summit. We'll see you there. Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and we have my wife, Cassandra. Today's topic, we talk obviously about mold testing all the time. We talked about mycotoxins a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, I can't remember. But I wanted to just kind of refresh our listeners on the different types of toxic mold testing. Because as you know, there's tons of different tests.
Many. And it's not like one is the end-all be-all.
Right. And for our listeners, there is not a perfect test out there that's going to tell us everything. I'm sure some of the professionals that listen would be like, no, if you do this test, well, there are tests to put all the pieces of the puzzle together, but I don't believe there's one single test that's going to tell us all we want to know.
Agreed, because nothing exists in a vacuum.
Exactly. You know, we explain it, or I always explain it, like the medical field. Is there one perfect test out there?
Nope, it's a series of things.
Yeah, I mean, if you go like to Mark Hyman or a bunch of the functional medicine doctors, they have a panel of tests.
They do.
And I don't even know how many tests are in those.
I'm sure a lot, but it's a lot. And a test only gives you a snapshot in one moment.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that things won't change next week.
Exactly. Which brings up a really good point, and I bring this up all the time when we talk about testing. In my opinion, it's more important to do an inspection than it is to do testing. Now, every situation's unique. So I'm not saying testing's not worth it without an inspection, but a visual inspection gives us a way better picture of the overall health of your home.
What does a visual inspection do from your perspective that testing alone cannot do?
Well, it just gives us the property conditions. Anytime somebody, let's say it's a consultation or someone buys a mycotoxin testing package and that's all they get is the testing package. There's no consultation with it. When I see those results, I typically have to ask a lot more questions. Meaning, what led you to this? Was there a moisture intrusion event? An inspection, once again, doesn't give us all the answers, but it gives me a good picture of the building itself. I can see how old it is. I can see maybe they don't dust very often. I can see there's a bunch of water stains. Maybe they got a bunch of pets. Like, it just gives us a decent overall perspective of what we're dealing with.
Well, and don't you also think that a visual inspection really helps you understand root cause, whereas testing just helps you understand where things are because of the root cause?
Exactly.
Okay.
Because, when it comes to indoor air quality and testing, period, we need to know what led to the reason we're doing the testing.
Correct.
That's the first question I always ask my clients. Like, why did you decide to do the test? Well, then they say, well, I've been sick, or my spouse has been sick, or we have a child that's been sick. Like, there's always something, or our basement flooded a year ago, and since then we haven't felt real well. So doing an inspection, obviously, my inspections take all day.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the inspection is kind of interviewing the client and saying, okay, what's been going on? Have you done medical testing? Does someone have medical issues? Have you done previous mold testing? An inspection just gives you a lot more information.
Absolutely. So when should somebody do testing?
So our listeners know I'm really big on not doing a bunch of testing. I feel like sometimes that people in our industry, let's just say they charge $100 per sample. Well, that $100 is not what it's costing them. So in other words, they're making money off of testing. And if you're going to just try to flood the client with testing, it's just, in my opinion, and once again, every situation's unique. But if remediation is the next step, that's the key. I don't believe a bunch of testing is relevant. Does that make sense?
So you're saying that people should do a visual inspection first?
Yeah, so to explain to our listeners how an inspection works, when I go on an inspection, typically they're out of town. So I give my client a price for me to show up and do the inspection. Then I give them the pricing for the testing, the different types of tests we offer. But then I say to them, we don't know what types of testing we're going to perform until we've done the inspection. The results of the inspection will typically dictate the types of testing we do.
So that brings up an interesting question, because I think people who are not familiar with mold testing, they are shocked by some of the prices they get for testing when it's testing time.
Yeah.
How do people financially prepare for ballpark what it may cost them to test?
So for our listeners, even if you're hiring just a company to test, you need to know what they charge. And I would assume, and I could be wrong, I would assume most professionals in my field are very clear with their clients. So if we do an air test, we have to do at least two, meaning we have to do an outside air test and then one inside. Meaning, if you do one inside, you have to do a baseline, which is the outside. If our listeners don't know that, they're like, well, so now you're charging me for two tests, and I thought I was just having to do an air test inside the home. Our listeners should understand, if we're going to do an air test, it's two tests minimum. Now, when we do surface sampling, going back to your question, when should people test? If we visibly see mold on an inspection, we're going to do surface sampling.
Okay.
To verify whether or not it is mold.
Okay.
When I do an inspection, like, one of my recent inspections I did, I got there, they didn't think that they had mold issues, but they wanted an inspection based on medical testing, and they had done mycotoxin testing. They thought the mycotoxin testing, the reason it looked the way it did was because they had a fridge that had issues, and there was some mold on like the sill and inside the fridge. Well, I get there and I do the inspection and I get into the crawl space and I find visible mold. Well, once it's all said and done, I didn't do any testing. I always leave it up to my clients, like, what tests do you want? Here's what they're going to cost. They knew remediation was the next step.
Okay.
We could have done surface sampling, depending, once again, on the situation, would dictate if we're going to do that. But it's not always necessary to test. Let's say that inspection, I found no concerns. no water stains, everything looked good, that's when we go to probably run an air test.
Okay.
To just see. And for an air test, we can test, we do the outside test, then we do, let's just say we do 4 inside. We do one in the kitchen. We do one in one of the kids' bedrooms. We do one in the primary bedroom, master bedroom, whatever people want to call it. And then we do one in one common area, let's say like the family room.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of gives us a snapshot of, based on the results, where the problematic areas are.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. So you're saying it's important for people up front to ask anybody that they're considering doing mold testing, what types of mold testing do you do and how much should I expect to pay for this?
Exactly.
So that they have a realistic preview of what they're going to pay.
Yeah, and another important aspect is, does the IEP, Indoor Environmental Professional, do they just forward the client the lab report? Because the lab report goes to the IEP. Correct. They're the ones filling out the chain of custody. They're the ones having to pay the lab fees. If the IEP is only going to just forward or send the client the lab report, what good is that?
Yeah, it doesn't mean much without interpretation.
Exactly.
So the question to ask is not only what do you charge to run the test, but do you provide interpretation after receiving the results of the test?
Yep. Or some sort of letter or follow-up or whatever.
Okay, so that's really important. Now, traditional testing versus non-traditional testing, what's the difference in mold?
So for our listeners, what I call traditional would be just basic mold testing. Air samples, tape lifts, swabs, and bulk samples. Those are the cheapest type of tests. That's why I call it traditional. The lab takes the samples that I send to them. They look at it under a microscope, and they tell us what types of molds are there and what the concentration is. That's the cheapest testing because it's giving you information, but not a whole lot.
Okay.
When we get into what I would say non-traditional testing, that's when we get into like viable testing, qPCR testing, those types of things that cost a lot more.
Okay. And so, I've noticed lately that air testing is getting a lot of criticism. Why is that?
I can't speak for other IEPs, but I think a lot of people, the reason it gets the criticism is, so let's say the home is inspected and they find no concerns, and then they do air testing. And if it's just without aggravating anything, meaning you don't go in with a leaf blower, you do the testing and everything looks fine.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the IEP is telling you. Like, everything looks fine. It's normal. Well, if there's a hidden mold problem, that might not pick it up.
Okay. Like underneath floors, behind walls, that kind of thing. Air testing wouldn't necessarily pick it up. So then how would you how do you approach testing and inspection so that you get a more holistic view of what's going on?
Let's say you don't find anything in the inspection. So I want to be clear with our listeners. And I used to in the past, to provide just testing only.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just that. Usually while my air pump's running, I'd go look underneath the kitchen sink or go look around. But the problem with that I feel like was a downfall to that, is I didn't have an overall picture of the property itself. So I don't even offer that anymore.
Yeah.
We don't, not if you're going to have me on site. We don't even offer testing only.
Okay.
Because the testing doesn't give us a full picture. Let's say I do an inspection, don't find any concerns. The client hasn't had any medical testing done, isn't even really sure if mold's causing their symptoms. If I don't explain to them, like if I only do an air test, we might miss something. If I don't explain that to them and I'm clear about it, then they feel like I just took their money and ran.
Yeah.
So what I do is I explain to them, so for air testing, there are times we could miss something.
Mm-hmm.
Because depending on the air pressures, which I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, there could be something we're missing, like a hidden problem below the floor, like you said.
Okay.
Well, the reason we miss that is because those mold spores are not airborne.
Exactly.
And I mentioned aggravated testing. That's literally going in there with a leaf blower.
Yeah, to shake stuff up.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why, going back to your initial question, that's why air testing gets the negativity it gets. And people will just poo-poo it away and be like, you can't trust that. Well, you can't trust any single test.
In
It's a
isolation.
puzzle.
Okay, exactly. And you've got to put the pieces together, which requires inspection, traditional testing, non-traditional testing, and other things.
Yeah. And so, like, the way I would say it is traditional testing, which is only reporting the mold types.
Mhm.
We've got to go a little deeper and charge more because
Okay.
that's what our labs charge us. And we need qPCR testing,
Okay.
which is going to report the mold species.
What do you say to people who swear by a test like ERMI and HERTSMI, or they're like, that's the test? What do you say to that?
Well, I, as an IEP, I don't give my allegiance to any specific test at all. For those that say that, does tell me that maybe their motives aren't for the client. It might be for money.
Interesting.
And they're an affiliate and they're charging the client whatever price and they're making how many ever dollars on it. It's just that's one snapshot and one piece of that puzzle.
Correct. And if you're going to personalize the care to each unique client, you can't just assume off the bat that it's got to be this one test.
Exactly.
Because the client's situation may be different.
Yeah, and our listeners have heard me say this time and time and time again. We have to do medical testing. We have to do mycotoxin testing. We maybe have to get into the VOCs, endotoxins, actinos,
Radon.
and radon. Like, air quality, radon's a big issue. So we can't, if somebody's sick because of mold exposure, typically we're going to have to see the medical side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Not meaning like I'm going to play your doctor. We have a disclaimer that says that this is not medical advice.
Correct.
But we have to have something to go off of. And, if we have a client that says, well, I've had medical testing done and there are no concerns, that doesn't mean there aren't concerns. Radon was a good point. For radon, for the most part, by the time you see any symptoms, you have lung cancer.
Exactly.
That's why you can't just, poo-poo away air testing. It's just part of the process.
But don't you think that's why people who have mold concerns should put together a mold support team and not just assume it's one thing or one person or one test or one area?
Yeah. And I was doing I would say it was more like a discovery call to speak at a summit. And that's what I was explaining. Like, it's really important to build your team. You can't just hire Steve and think that I'm going to be able to figure it all out.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a mold literate doctor, functional medicine doctor. You're going to have sometimes a health coach.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to gather that team of an inspector, a remediation contractor that knows what they're doing. It's a whole team of people. Think of it like a surgery. Does your orthopedic walk into the OR or not, wherever you're having it done? But if you're doing surgery, do you think they go in there by themselves?
Certainly not. They've got a team.
I mean, they have a scrub tech.
Mm-hmm.
They have, different equipment like x-ray machines and the anesthesiologist. And they have tons of different things. And it's a team.
Yeah.
It's the same thing in mold.
Absolutely. So then just coming full circle to this whole idea about testing and what tests to do or not to do and inspections, what's your call to action for people?
I wouldn't just take one test. So you brought up the ERMI. I wouldn't just do one test and then base all of your decisions on that one test. Never.
Okay.
You could, it could be as simple as the lab took your samples and mixed them up with somebody else's.
That's true.
It's not going to help anybody if you make a very big decision based on one test.
Yeah.
So make sure you do different types of tests and you have an inspection.
There you go. And, you can also start with a VPA, virtual property assessment.
Right. I get asked this all the time. Well, what can Steve do from a computer? You'd be surprised.
Yeah.
Like, how often do I tell you, yeah, we found visible mold?
Absolutely. Doing a virtual property assessment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not ideal. So for our listeners, on-site inspections, I think, is the best option. But a VPA, if you want me to do it, I can do it remotely. And, it takes a while. I think we were just talking about one that took, 6 hours?
Absolutely. But then you get a lot of information, you get a lot of education,
Exactly.
and they have your eyes on the case.
Exactly. You can go to our website, cnccontractorservices.com. There's VPA. It probably says virtual property assessment, just so our listeners I can't find it. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, info@cnccontractorservices.com. But we appreciate all our listeners. Have a great week.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're worried about mold or indoor air quality in your home but don't know where to start, CNC Contractor Services has you covered. A virtual property assessment gives you real-time expert guidance on what's going on in your living environment, all from the comfort of your home. Whether you're buying, building, or just want peace of mind, visit cnccontractorservices.com to learn more about scheduling your VPA with Steve today.